Well, that was an amazingly power-packed panel. Thank you so much, Shireen, for taking us through that excellent conversation. As we move forward to the last session for BioAsia 2021, the virtual edition, let me set the stage by telling you that this panel will talk about what happens post COVID 19. We are finding our ways out of this pandemic. But if we look at the year 2020, it will be remembered for the disruptions it made across the globe, for the lives it took. But it will also be remembered uh, for the year that saw the fastest development of vaccine in under 12 months. It was also a year that saw pharma companies and global healthcare companies collaborate and come together in a manner that was not thought about in the year before that. It was the promise of new innovations. It was the power of the collaboration that 2020 will also be remembered for. Well, it was the time when developers of new medicines were given this opportunity to rise to the occasion, and they did. There were certain hurdles. There are still certain questions we don't have answers to. There are still newer mutant species of the SARS-CoV-2 that we need to fight against. But then the way collaborations have happened, the way digital and data has been used, the way we have gone back, looked at older drugs and brought them out at the fore, sets the stage for what would happen once this COVID pandemic is behind us. To discuss this and more, to understand if the collaborations will continue, how will digital and data work, in the post-COVID pandemic, in this very special coffee table conversation, which has been titled as Reimagining R&D Post-COVID, Collaboration, Data, and Repurposing, I have two very special guests, persons who have been at the helm of research and development. Andrew Plump, President R&D Takeda, and Lutz Hegemann, Group Head of Corporate Affairs and Global Health at Novartis. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me here on this panel. I would like to start by talking about what have been the best learnings from the year 2020 and in the COVID era till now. Andy, if I can pose that question to you first, what in your sense has been the best learning in the last year?
Thank you very much, Archana. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with yourself and with Lutz on this important topic. Looking forward to the next half hour and unpacking some of what's happened over the last year and what we can look forward to in the coming future. Your question specifically about the learnings in 2020, and I could go on for the entire fireside chat with learnings, but I'll keep my comments brief. The first learning is an unfortunate one, which is that we should have been ready. We knew this was coming. We probably even knew what it was going to look like, and we were ill prepared. I think that's the first learning that we can't forget. And the biggest fear I have is that in 6 or 12 or 18 months from now, when we're moving back towards the new normal of the world, is that we lose sight of the pandemic risk that's in front of us. That's the first learning. The second learning, I think you highlighted exceptionally well in your opening statement. I mean, we stepped up as an ecosystem and as an industry, and what we were able to accomplish in unbelievable record time was just remarkable. And it's not just the development of the vaccines that you highlighted, which is remarkable, without cutting corners, let's say. It was the development and approval of novel neutralizing monoclonal antibodies that actually were accelerated even beyond the vaccines from start to finish in 6 months. I mean, that just blows my mind. And then the biology that we were able to unravel in such a short period of time, it just speaks to where healthcare is in 2021. And I think that we could do anything. And this, proves it, what's happening in COVID-19. There are a whole series of other learnings around how we can take what's happened over the last year and bring it forward, but I think I can save that for later in the discussion.
Well, let me come to you now. As companies, as big pharma, did you all anticipate and see this sort of a change coming when you look at the collaborations that happened? Now, Pfizer would not have been able to develop a vaccine so early on if they did not collaborate, with BioNTech. Novartis tying up with Pfizer to manufacture their vaccines in their own plants. We have had Sputnik V and AstraZeneca looking at developing vaccines together to check for efficacy. On drugs, we've seen multiple companies come together and do clinical trials on a common mode, whether it's the recovery, whether it's the solidarity trial. We've seen collaborations that were not possible earlier. Did companies anticipate this sort of a change?
Yeah, thank you very much, Archana, first of all, for having me here together with Andy. Hello to everyone. I would have loved to be with you in person in Hyderabad, city which I visit very frequently and which I like a lot. Unfortunately, it has to be remotely. I mean, you highlighted the power of collaboration, which is truly something that impresses me at the beginning of this pandemic, but also how the private sector, but not only the private sector, I would say almost the entire ecosystem has grown together and has rallied around a common goal, and that is to join in the fight against this pandemic. And I mean, companies have been collaborating, of course, in the past, particularly, I would say, in the room of global health, neglected tropical diseases being just one example. But I think we have never seen collaboration at the scale that we currently see. And you mentioned a few examples, and let me highlight some of our experiences. What has certainly proven to be very powerful is the collaboration that's being coordinated by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And you know that you had the president of Global Health, Dr. Trevor Mundell, earlier here in the program. And the Gates Foundation has really played a key role to be a convener for pharmaceutical companies to have an open dialogue and to find complementary areas where we can support one another. That can be in data sharing, that can be in helping each other out with manufacturing capacity, as we now see it with Novartis supporting Pfizer-BioNTech in the vaccine manufacture, but also other companies like Bayer or Sanofi, and to create a room where this collaboration can be forged, it can be filled with meaning, is certainly something that is incredibly helpful, and has also led, as many of you may recall, to a shared declaration by 15 companies at the UN General Assembly to commit to equitable access and affordable pricing to vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments around the world. In addition to that, I think it's also important that we have seen networks emerging, like the ACTIVE network that the National Institute of Health are leading. You had mentioned other networks that allow a more coordinated and a harmonized approach to address some of the clinical questions, some of the trials like recovery, which have truly proven to be tremendously beneficial. But then last but not least, I would say also the collaboration with academia, but also with health authorities have sort of become very different from what it used to be in the past, much more collaborative and much more seamless. And I think this is the reason why we have seen some of those tremendous advancements, for instance, on the vaccine front specifically, that we have seen and that we are all extremely grateful for.
Right. But Lutz, if I can take a follow-up question on that. You spoke about, the collaboration also with the academia, with the regulatory systems. But do you see this, going forward in the post-COVID pandemic era also similar collaborations happening, or will this restrict itself? Will this very beautiful, the ecosystem coming together restrict itself to a situation of an emergency like that of a COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, which of course is very difficult to predict, because everyone in this ecosystem would need to fully lean in order to continue in this spirit. Personally, I would hope that we can retain many elements into the post-COVID era, and I'm very confident. I think everyone has seen the power of this collaboration that is indeed truly inspiring, and that hopefully we will continue even post-COVID-19. But of course, there is no guarantee. I think we all need to approach this with the best intent. And we have now seen how well it can work. So hopefully that gives the stimulus to everyone to continue.
All right. Andy, if I can, ask you about the COVID-19 Plasma Alliance, where you are one of the leading members, how it is progressing and, what sort of progress has it seen? And do you see that expand beyond the COVID, pandemic times as well? Looking at the usage of plasma for other, sort of infectious diseases or other aspects?
Terrific, and it's a great sequitur to the comments that Lutz was just making around collaboration and then future collaboration beyond the pandemic. So Archana, specifically to your question on the Plasma Alliance, so what is this? So we've known that in the past for infections, convalescent plasma can be effective as prophylaxis and in treating disease for certain infections. We've known in the past that when you concentrate plasma and you create a hyperimmune fraction, that can be even more potent in certain infections. And so very early on in the pandemic, we, Takeda, and several of the other plasma companies came together. It's very labor intensive, the collection and the fractionation of hyperimmune. So we decided to work very closely together in a philanthropic way to create the hyperimmune plasma and then to test it. We've done that in collaboration also with the NIH, with the NIAID, Tony Fauci's group, and we're now running a collaborative study where several companies are contributing hyperimmune to a single trial, and that the results from those studies should be coming out in the next couple of months. It's different. It's a different fraction than the purified monoclonals or even the monoclonal cocktails. It's a polyclonal fraction, so it's likely to have broader activity against, let's say, potentially resistant strains of the virus. So there's still a place, given the acceleration that we've seen with monoclonals, there's absolutely still a place if the trial works for the hyperimmune. But then your better question, I mean, it's been fantastic. What we've seen in terms of collaboration, just to emphasize what Lutz was saying earlier, has just been phenomenal. Everybody has just come together. I've been quite involved myself. I'm not a virologist and we're not a virology company, but we stepped in March of 2020 and started to put together groups of heads of R&D from our organizations, including Novartis, Jay Bradner at Novartis, and instantly people were working together trying to figure out how we could solve these problems. With respect to the future, Luke had commented on this, but I will as well. Whether we see within the plasma sphere a continued alliance like this or not, we'll see if it makes sense. But I absolutely see that we're going to continue to work more closely together. There are just too many problems that we face individually that we should be facing collectively. And it wasn't as if collaboration didn't exist before the pandemic. We had certainly many areas where we worked together, but I think the newfound trust, the relationships that we've built, and then the power of working together, I think is going to stimulate and fuel and accelerate more collaboration in the future.
Absolutely. The trust that the pharma industry has developed amongst themselves. Lutz, in your earlier comment, you mentioned about some of the critical diseases that have been left out during the COVID-19 pandemic. We also have reports suggesting that R&D for some of the critical, diseases that was being done, clinical trials that were being conducted, have all slowed down. Some of them halted because of multiple lockdowns across various parts of the world. Clinical research could not progress at the pace for other diseases. Add to that, most of the resources being moved for COVID-19 pandemic because that becomes a priority. As we try to figure our way out of this pandemic, how do we get, a hold? How does the pharma industry get a hold back on the clinical research for other critical ailments that have been slowed down? Lutz.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. My major concern as a public health physician is more what has happened to patients suffering from chronic diseases during the pandemic. And I've recently read an estimation that there will be many more patients dying because of COVID than they will die of COVID itself. And that is linked to the fact that the health systems are very much absorbed now in fighting the pandemic, and patients who are suffering from cancer are not getting their care. People with other chronic diseases potentially avoid visiting healthcare facilities. And I think that truly is concerning, and we'll have to find a way to get those patients back into the medical system and into appropriate care as quickly as possible. With respect to drug development, I mean, we have all seen to some extent, of course, particularly clinical trials slowing down again because of the capacity being utilized for acute care of COVID patients. But I think due to the fact that we are using a lot of technology now, we can do remote monitoring visits, we can do a lot of things that typically would require on-the-ground interactions now remotely, that the slowdown in the development of new drug candidates advancing the pipeline will be manageable, hopefully with just a few months of delay. And if we are all working together here as well, I believe there is a fair chance that we will be able to catch up on that.
Okay. So newer methods and methodologies to conduct the same trials that we would do otherwise in person could help us get back on the lost time. Andy, if I can ask you and take your view on the fact that, do you think COVID-19 and the way research has progressed and, how the realities have changed now when we look at healthcare, how we look at health priorities for various, types of countries, whether it's the richer nations, whether it's the low or middle income nations, do you think pharma companies will now start re-looking at their R&D pipelines? Do you think the focus that big pharma till now that they had on the oncology or the non-communicable diseases side or more critical ailments, would that shift somewhere to infectious diseases as well? Do you anticipate that happening?
Well, I hope so. The world needs that, and I think so. We'll have to wait and see. I have to, by the way, I can't let this go. I have to go back to Lutz's comments, which I agree with. For us, for example, we've seen delays in our pipeline. We have over 200 clinical studies that we're running, and we've seen delays in maybe a third, let's say, and the delays can be substantial. But what I've said is that we're learning so much, and we're so proactive in bringing new ways of working, digitalization, decentralization, engagement with regulatory agencies to do remote, site investigations, for example, that if you project out 3 years, if we can keep this momentum going, the pandemic will have overall saved us time. So in a year, we lose time. But in 3 years, if we carry this momentum forward, we go faster. Not just make up the time, as you're suggesting, but we even go faster.
Okay.
But with respect to your prognostication question of will the industry change its focus, I think so. I mean, we have to. And even before the pandemic, there were some signs that the industry was moving in that direction. You may be aware there was a fund that was created, $1 billion fund that was contributed to by 20 pharmaceutical companies, including Novartis, including Takeda, to fund innovative entrepreneurial research for antimicrobial resistant strains of bacteria, which, as we know, is a huge problem. The challenge is both scientific and also commercial. So there was already some headway there. I think you have many companies who are vaccine companies and who work in virology. Some of the breakthroughs that we're seeing in mRNA vaccines, for example, one of the reasons the mRNA vaccines came about so rapidly is that they're not easy to manufacture, but they're simpler to manufacture with high quality than a protein-based or a live virus-based vaccine. And so if we can do it less expensive and more quickly, that opens up business opportunities. And I think in the end, we all want to do the right thing, and we all want to make sure that we're focused on patients and globally. In the end, though, there's so much risk and there's so much cost involved. There needs to be an upside. There needs to be an incentive. And so if we can lower costs, if we can accelerate, we can leverage some of the modalities, I think the business case will then be there. And I think you should start to see pharma companies changing their areas of focus.
Right. That was something I wanted to also ask, because drug development is an expensive proposition, and will pharma companies look at going into drugs which are for the low and middle income countries for diseases in the infectious disease category particularly? And you made that point that if you can hasten the process, reduce the time, it can maybe make sense. Lutz, do you agree to the points that Andy made on this? And at Novartis, would you be looking at any sort of a R&D pipeline, or are you currently looking at any sort of a relook at your R&D pipeline?
Yeah, no, I would very much agree with Andy's sentiments. And I would hope, we don't have a precedent from the past here, but that the memory of the world now is strong enough to sort of not walk away from the threat, the experience of this threat that has hit us so hard 2 years down the line, which has happened unfortunately previously, and which led to the lack of preparedness that Andy had outlined earlier in the interview. Now, with regards to diseases of poverty or diseases that only exist in part of the world but have created tremendous suffering, at Novartis, we have been always active in this space, like many other companies, in complementary spaces. To give our example here, we have a fully dedicated research facility with about 150 scientists focusing on parasitic diseases. That includes malaria, leprosy, Chagas disease, leishmaniasis, some of those diseases that are associated with low and middle income countries. Other companies take complementary approaches, and I'm actually very happy that through informal discussions, we have sort of found ways to leverage our unique scientific strengths in a complementary way, because there is no point in all companies just working on malaria, but no one working on HIV. But I think it has become almost natural that different companies have different scientific expertise, and that ultimately addresses a spectrum of different conditions, and we remain very committed to this space.
Okay. Lutz, is there any relook or any thought of going back to vaccines? That was one space, and I think the learnings from the last pandemic, which was the H1N1, is what somewhere was one of the triggers for the company to, move out of that business. But is there any sort of relook on the vaccine space?
Well, I think to an extent, yes, but not that we would reactivate our former vaccine division, because we were subscale and you are not competitive if you sort of don't have all the resources at your hand. So I think what is important is that across the industry, we bring complementary skills to bear. And initially, it's good that many people work on sort of creating a vaccine for COVID-19. But when you have 5 or 10 or 20 vaccine candidates, I think it is more important that you focus on a few and help to accelerate those, or to increase manufacturing capacity, as now a number of companies, including ourselves with Pfizer-BioNTech, do, which I believe is more of a service to mankind than trying to have competing research programs that potentially may be subscale or may not get you to the desired outcome.
So it would mainly be like an accelerator program for smaller companies who are into vaccine research, or will it only be restricted to manufacturing?
Well, it really depends on the situation, and we are evaluating it. Well, the point that I wanted to make is that I don't think every company needs to do everything in order to serve the global needs in the best possible way. I think you need to have diversity in the global health challenges that you are addressing. But then, for instance, in a pandemic like the one we are experiencing today, to then say, well, how can I contribute? Even the front runner candidate may not be the candidate that my laboratory has developed, but someone else's laboratory. I believe that is of better service ultimately.
Okay, okay. Andy, if I can talk to you about when we're talking about this re-looking at R&D pipelines, do you think, and for Takeda particularly, also, would you be re-looking at your R&D pipeline from the purpose of repurposing of drugs? We've seen that take center stage during COVID-19. Multiple drugs from the ones like hydroxychloroquine, which was an everyday drug for countries like India, to even remdesivir, where we've seen drugs being used for an entirely different sort of an ailment or an indication. From that perspective, would we see companies now looking at repurposing more mainstream?
Well, so let me offer my bias around repurposing, and I'll go back to the past year and talk about our experience with repurposing. There are certainly opportunities to repurpose a medicine. So you make a molecule, you're targeting it for one disease, and then later you learn that it could be effective in another disease. But remember, you didn't specifically optimize that molecule for the disease you're now repurposing it for. And we're already up against a huge challenge in making a new medicine, right? To then expect that the new medicine is going to work for something that you didn't intend it for significantly lowers your probability of success. And so I'm not a complete naysayer around repurposing, but I'm not the biggest fan of repurposing. I like targeted, focused drug discovery. With that said, particularly when you think about our immune system, because there are common denominators for our immune system as to how it affects disease. There's only so many different ways that our immune system can act. And when you have crude mechanisms, as many of our immune modulators are, that can modulate our immune system, that can work in many different places. And we saw that over the last year. The best, by far, repurposed drug is a drug that was found in the mid-20th century. It's a corticosteroid, right? Because the corticosteroids can suppress this violent immune reaction that seems to be doing much of the damage, particularly in hospitalized or sicker COVID patients. The reality is that very little else has worked. All right, let's be realistic. I don't know that we've been exhaustive in what we've tested, but very little else has worked. The other comment I'll make is another learning, going back to your first question, Archana, is that there was a lot of chaos at the beginning, and there was a lot of bad clinical science. We were running studies willy-nilly, testing everything in studies that were, quote, signal-seeking studies, which don't ever give any signal that helps anything. All they do is they gum up the system. Now, luckily, with companies like Novartis that were out there running really high-quality studies, we didn't run our own study, but we've been part of consortia running platform-based trials with other companies that are high-quality studies that give answers, right? So anyway, so your question is more to the future as well. Will we see more repurposing? I think as we start to have more and more molecules, as we start to develop more molecules that affect broad biological systems like immune modulators, I think you'll see some. You also, by the way, another feature here, which is not where you were going, but I'll mention, is that there's so much money right now in biotech and in venture, right? And a lot of that money is looking for anything. A lot of that money goes to very early innovation, but some of that money is just looking to take whatever it can get. And a repurposing company is a quick win company if it works. And so I do think in that context, and we've seen that in some of the structures that have come up, you'll see more repurposing. Whether we see more effective repurposing or not, we'll see.
Andy, you actually took from the next question that I was supposed to ask.
Sorry.
Excellent, because it set the stage for the next comment that I would want Lutz to, ponder upon, is whether repurposing worked or not. You spoke about, and he spoke about the example of dexamethasone. Even that works only in a very specific set of patients, and it's not a widespread, cure for COVID-19. We've seen drugs like HCQ, ivermectin, remdesivir, tocilizumab. We go back and forth. There has been no structured approach to trialing those drugs and understanding whether they work on X a set of patients or Y set of patients. So my question actually to Lutz was going to be, has repurposing of drugs actually worked? Because we still don't have a drug or a cure for COVID-19.
Yeah, no, I can only echo what Andy had said, that, I mean, the repurposing could only be sort of a bridging solution in my mind. And obviously, we have, I mean, a tremendous spectrum of medicines available in the world. And I think in terms of the intent, there's nothing wrong with sort of checking what is out there and looking at potential efficacy signals that could help bridge the time until we have a targeted therapy available. I think what is important is that we don't expect a targeted therapy to come out of a repurposing exercise, and that we don't just throw medicines into patients to look for signals, but that there has to be a scientific basis that would allow us to sort of have reasonable hope that this specific pathomechanism may be beneficial in these patients. I think what is even more complicated, of course, in the COVID-19 patients is that you have very, very different stages that the patient experience, and what may work and may be beneficial in one stage of the disease may be counterproductive actually in another stage of the disease.
Right, absolutely.
So I think the repurposing as such is something that I believe if you approach it with realistic hope, not that this could become the cure at all. And I mean, some of those potential candidates were clearly, the hope was taken out of every scientific proportion, which I think is dangerous. But if you do it diligently, then it can have its merits. Maybe one last thought here, and Andy touched upon that as well. What I would have wished for is a bit more coordination in how we go about this repurposing. Because ultimately, you sort of give patients hope. You potentially deprive them from a therapy that could be beneficial if you retest some of the hypotheses over and over and over again. And that's why I'm a big fan of some of these consortia trials, like what the NIH is running, like the recovery trial, where you can test in an ongoing way in a very harmonized fashion different scientific approaches. But then if it doesn't work, you also have to have the courage to move on and not try it yet in another trial that essentially only replicates the results that you have seen already before.
Right. I just wanted to briefly touch upon two examples, just taking this conversation forward on tocilizumab and on remdesivir. Tocilizumab, initial studies said the drug does not work. Now we are getting, research evidence suggesting, clinical evidence suggesting that the drug actually works. Same goes with remdesivir. The Solidarity trial puts a question mark on the efficacy of that drug, the fact that it does not work to reduce mortality or change anything. But the trials that Gilead performed suggested otherwise. It suggested a more promising approach to the drug. My question, Andy, to you is, there seems to be no clarity on the methodologies being used. But we also understand this was in a pandemic situation. This was at a time when we needed drugs as, and cure as fast as possible. But it also highlights the cracks in the system, whether we talk about the clinical trial designs or we talk about the regulatory processes. Where does it fall short, and what can be changed so that this repurposing actually becomes a more promising avenue rather than just running helter-skelter?
I think you comment on something that's a problem even outside of a pandemic, which is that there's immense variability from patient to patient and immense variability from clinical trial to clinical trial for a multitude of reasons. Specifically to the pandemic, if we use this as an example of it's a new disease, right? But it mirrors a lot of other diseases that are out there. We have to have a deep understanding of what the natural history of a disease looks like, and how it affects individuals across demographics, across age, across comorbidities, right? And the only way to do that is by studying populations, both cross-sectionally and longitudinally. And the only way to really do that effectively is to have really large data sets, right? So what I'm getting to is data sharing. One of the critical pieces, and we actually saw that early on in the pandemic, was one of the great wins where groups coming together, stepping up, sharing methodology and how we were analyzing real world evidence to understand what the natural history of this disease looks like. Because when you do, then you have a much better sense for how to run a trial. So I think more application of real world evidence, real world data generation, and better data sharing.
Okay, better data sharing can help us collaboratively look at, how a particular drug could be repurposed or the clinical trials. Lutz, do you, what about the regulatory process? What about the regulatory systems? Is there a scope for a newer way to look at, approvals for clinical trials, or, redesigning clinical trials for other critical diseases as well, where it takes 6 years, 8 years to go through that entire process? This last 1 year told us that there can be a different way to look at it, both for repurposed drugs and otherwise.
Yeah, I think there is, of course, a lot of progress also being made by the regulators. We see increased collaboration between different regulatory bodies. We see discussions around harmonization of clinical trial designs, of endpoints that you use in clinical trials. And that, of course, is tremendously beneficial to making drug development, particularly clinical development, a little easier. I mean, if you have to have a certain trial set up, a certain endpoint in order to get your approval with one regulatory agency, and then you need to have a totally different setup to satisfy the needs of another regulatory agency, that's costly both in terms of resources, but also in terms of time. And we do see, of course, a lot of efforts to harmonize this. And I could only hope that the regulatory authorities continue on that path, because that would make our role certainly much easier. And then the other part is the ease of access to regulators, both during a submission phase, where we do see, for instance, the FDA, of course, having accelerated reviews also outside of the pandemic for high priority disease areas, the same with the European Medicines Agency, that accepts sort of like rolling submissions where you don't sequentially first collect your data, put the whole dossier together, and then only submit, but where the agency would look at data sort of while the next set of data is still being generated. I mean, this becomes, of course, a question almost of life or death in a pandemic situation, but we do see, of course, that regulators are more open to a more flexible and more transparent approach, having more consultations. But I would hope that this trend continues, and also that maybe the regulators throughout the pandemic have become even more comfortable with this approach, see the benefits, and continue to move this into the post-pandemic era as well.
Okay, from this perspective of hoping for an easier regulatory or a more broad-based regulatory approach, when we talk of the clinical trials that have slowed down, that we spoke about earlier and touched upon in the conversation, Lutz, do you see your pipeline moving faster post the pandemic? In terms of the slowed down programs, what is the impact there, and what sort of regulatory support are you anticipating?
Yeah, maybe I'm not as optimistic as Andy in saying, well, we not only make up for the delay, but will overcompensate. I mean, that would be tremendous, of course, if that happened and would truly advance science. I mean, our current efforts are really geared towards trying to avoid delays. And the investments that we have made into data, digital technologies serve us very well. They were not made with a pandemic in mind, but you need to start sort of 5 years earlier to make these investments in order to then benefit from them when you need them. And this was, I would say, a very good coincidence that we were ready to move into a remote situation at the time that the pandemic hit, even though we weren't building it for the pandemic. So I do hope that we can avoid the delays here. And just one word on the regulatory process. I mean, flexibility to me, and just want to be sure that this is not misunderstood, doesn't mean cutting corners or reducing the quality or the rigor. It is more, I would say, making sure that we move from a truly sequential approach into a more parallel approach, into a more collaborative approach. And as I said, I mean, I'm seeing health authorities really stepping up to this and also getting more comfortable with it, which makes me very confident about the future.
Absolutely. How do you see India placed when we talk about R&D, when we talk about NCEs, NDEs, and the new drug development? On the vaccine front, India has stepped up as the manufacturer for the world. We're also doing development and clinical trials for a lot of first generation vaccines, whether it is the Oxford AstraZeneca or whether it is the J&J or Sputnik V. And there are also other vaccines that are under development from ground up, whether it's the Bharat Biotech vaccine, which is already approved under clinical trial mode in India, or Zydus Cadila and the others in the pipeline. Andy, if I can, ask you, how do you view India from the perspective of developing new drugs? We've been on this process, but we still haven't been able to come out with a new drug per se. Vaccine, we still have a fair amount of expertise here. But what's your view? Where is India placed, and what sort of bets would you put here?
I wish that we had an audience in front of us and we can have a dialogue with the audience in India about this. It's an area that I've been quite interested in for many years. So there's two ways to address the question. One is innovation within India and how we nurture innovation within India, which I know is something that's very important to broadly, including the government of India. There's also ensuring that innovation comes to India, so that if Novartis or Takeda or whomever has an innovative medicine that will make a difference for patients' lives, that medicine finds its way to the largest democracy in the world. Right, because too much unmet medical need for us to be neglecting, and up until a few years ago, that wasn't happening. So there've been sea changes over the past few years in IP protection, in building clinical trial infrastructure, and database management. But actually, I don't think it's quite where it needs to be. What we saw in China a few years ago, overnight, China opened up, and we've seen this flooding of China with innovation. That's not quite happening at the same scale in India. And in fact, before the pandemic, I sit on a board here in Boston called the USA India Chamber of Commerce. And every year we put together a really fantastic session that brings together India innovation and Western innovation. And I've been on this for many years leading this event. And I decided I wanted to put together a working group to see if we could come together to help create better infrastructure in India. And we actually had started to get some of this off the ground. We were really focused on clinical trial site infrastructure because that's a big gap right now. And then the pandemic hit, so we had to walk away. But I think there's a huge opportunity to bring innovation into India. With respect to your comment, how do you nurture innovation from within India? That's a hard question. It takes a long time. There are very few ecosystems in the world that are innovation centers, right? If you look around, I happen to sit in one in Boston, you have one in London, you have one in San Francisco, and then you small pockets across the world. It takes an immense effort. It takes capital, it takes entrepreneurial management, and it takes a mindset actually that needs to be developed. Not that mindset doesn't exist, but all of these pieces need to come together to really drive that. So it's a question that I find harder to answer than the first question.
Okay, Lutz, I'll take that comment forward from Andy. 3 years or 4 years ago at BioAsia itself, we had spoken to Vaz Narasimhan, and he had said that India is still a few years away, from actually getting a new drug being discovered here. Looking at how things have changed over the last 1 year, looking at how the government is now pushing for R&D, do you think, and companies are coming forward, do you think there could be a faster timeline now that India could look at, becoming a center for innovation of drugs as well? What is your view? And do you think the government collaborations here is helping companies like Novartis and the others?
Yeah, I mean, I've been visiting India and helping to build our life science hub in Hyderabad for the last 15 years. And I think we should not overlook the tremendous progress that India has made. And to me, 1 year time horizon in order to accomplish something that maybe other countries have taken several decades is too short of a time horizon. So I think, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the tremendous progress that has been made already. That includes, for instance, much more predictable clinical trial regulations. It includes stronger IP awareness, I would say, which are all very positive signs. And I think we have to acknowledge that you have some of the brightest minds in the world in India. And I would hope that we'll find a way to harness this power in order to then make the step towards discovering and developing medicines in India. But I think you still have a bit of a way to go. And the size of the country, of course, is both a blessing and a curse to some extent. Because to take 1.3 billion people along is much more difficult than if you focus on a smaller ecosystem. But as I said, I mean, I see very, very positive signs. I would encourage to keep investing in clinical trial infrastructure, because that is very, very close to where truly the innovation happens. It helps not only advance patient care, but also generally spark scientific ideas, helps test hypotheses. And then what we see, and Andy mentioned some of the sort of life science centers that we have in the world. What we see here is indeed a very close collaboration between academia, private sector, and government. And I don't think you can ever be too strong in this area. So I would also encourage everyone in India to continue on this very good trajectory. But I think you have made tremendous progress, and we need to build on that.
Okay. I have very few minutes left before I need to wrap up. So I'll quickly take your comments and 2-3 very critical questions that I would not want to miss out on. Andy, you spoke about bringing innovations to India or to countries like India. This is something that has become a discussion, a debate. It was there before COVID-19 also, and we've seen this divide even grow further more during COVID-19, especially if we talk of the asymmetry on drugs, or now when we talk about COVID-19 vaccines. Health workers in Africa are still not getting a single shot of the vaccine, where there are richer countries that have supply agreements that can vaccinate their citizens 3 or 4 times over. So this asymmetry has been widening. While there has been multiple conversations, do you think in the times to come now, with the learnings of the pandemic, the pharma industry and the regulators and the governments can look at a different sort of a collaboration? I know it's happening. There are still the CEPI, the Gavi, the COVAX facility that is being spoken about, but they are still struggling to gather vaccine doses. They are still struggling because of vaccine nationalism. How do we go forward when we talk of collaboration and when we talk about actual access, equitable access of drugs and vaccines going forward?
Yeah, and you're not referring specifically to COVID-19 related vaccines. You're thinking beyond COVID-19. Is that right, Archana? Yeah.
Yeah, both. Yeah.
Well, firstly, I think we have an obligation to be thinking about access and affordability of healthcare for the globe, and it's something I know we do. It's something I know Novartis does. Unfortunately, I think it's still a very difficult. It's still a challenge, and if you think about some of the exciting new modalities that are starting to emerge, cell therapies and gene therapies, and the immense cost of goods, and the immense associated then costs to administer these therapies, I think it's going to further challenge our ability to think on a global scale. We have programs that all of our drugs are made accessible in an affordable way to patients, and we have sliding scales that we use. It's a program that we started and that we're building more and more. I think first and foremost, we need to be developing drugs. To go back to the comment of bringing innovation into the countries, we need to establish clinical trial infrastructure in Africa. We need to do it in India. We needed to do it in countries that are underserved. That's first and foremost. I think we need organizations like CEPI and Gavi and Gates to help to pull for the masses vaccines and antibiotics. But I'm concerned, actually, and I'll tell you the biggest concern I have, which is that the COVID period is going to be a tough one economically on the world. And it's going to strain resources, and it's going to strain availability of resources for some of these organizations, not-for-profit organizations that make these steps. And so I think we're going to have to really think about how we do this. But it starts with developing within the countries, because once you do that, you open up markets, which then brings drugs in, and then there's ways to drive access and affordability.
Okay. Just as I take the last comments from the two of you, Lutz, I will talk to you about, I would like you to talk about how digital data and AI can be used now, in the days to come, in the months to come, both for COVID-19 diagnostic drugs, as well as for other critical diseases. Especially at a time when we are seeing the virus mutate. It's challenging the scientists on a daily basis. With the South African variant, we still have not been able to find the best vaccine that can work. We have the UK variant, we have variants in US, even in India for that matter. So how can we use predictive analysis? Is there a way to do that, of identifying genomic sequencing of the virus to understand what could be the next set of mutations? We already have certain apps that are giving us some predictive analysis, but what's the way forward on that as far as the digital data AI is concerned?
Yeah, I think I would almost say the sky is the limit here, because I'm amazed how much progress we are making with artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and how we can harness the power of data. And I see here two main areas. One is to, as you said, to really predict what is the next sort of turn that the COVID-19 pandemic takes, but also what could be potentially the next pandemic after hopefully we have overcome the COVID-19 pandemic. But then also what we do see, and we see this across the industry, is the power of data to facilitate in drug discovery and drug development, and being more predictable on the target selection, potentially using data in order to help with the benefit risk or prediction of the benefit risk analysis. So I think we frankly are just at the beginning here, and we have a tremendous opportunity to leverage the existing data better, both in order to predict threats, but also then in order to find solutions.
But do we have the enough infrastructure to go ahead on that line, Lutz?
Well, I think the infrastructure that you see today is outdated almost tomorrow. I mean, there is so much work going on, and the field is moving so incredibly fast that I believe we are making continuous progress. And if we can bring this to the benefit of mankind, I think that we are in a very good place. But what is possible today was unimaginable just 5 or 10 years ago.
Absolutely. I'll give you the last word, Andy, on this panel, and I will connect the first answer and the first comment that you made. Learnings from 2020 and the COVID era was that we were not prepared enough. With what has gone through in the last 1 year, the way the pharma industry has moved, the way from the learnings of the last 1 year, and the innovations, collaborations that we've seen, there is also a general consensus that COVID-19 is not the last pandemic, and we will not have to wait for 100 years more to come to another pandemic. It will be much sooner and faster. Do you think when that hits, the world, the pharma industry, the regulators will be better prepared than what they were when SARS-CoV-2 hit us?
Well, we have to be, and we can't be less prepared. So the answer to your question is a resolute yes. The question is, are we going to be prepared at the level that we can be and need to be? And I believe that we have that opportunity. We just can't forget. This is complex. It's not simple, and each of us need to step up. Governments need to step up. Academic institutions, not-for-profits, and the industry needs to step up. And we need to do. I love what Lutz said earlier. We shouldn't all be doing the same thing. We need to do what we're good at. We're really good at making medicines, making drugs to specific targets. And we know, I'll give you a vignette. Actually, I've spoken about this with Jay Bradner at NIBR quite a bit. If we had continued efforts when SARS came out, SARS-CoV-1, and we had continued efforts in making antivirals that targeted the main protease of that virus, we would have a drug today that would target the main protease of SARS-CoV-2 because their active site is completely overlapping. Okay, so not only will there be another pandemic, we have a good sense of what it's going to be. It's likely to be a coronavirus. If you look at the last 20 years, we've had SARS, MERS, and CoV-2. They're all in the same family with highly related structural proteins. So we're now stepping up as an industry. There's a small group of which I'm a part, working very closely to figure out how we can establish a lasting and sustainable coordinated effort so that we are prepared. But we better be, I mean, for all of us, because this will absolutely happen again. My dream is that when it does, we isolate it. We isolate it right away because we know what it is and we have effective means of treating it. Because we know that human social isolation only goes so far.
Absolutely, absolutely. The hope is we would be much better prepared than what we were, and I hope Lutz also agrees to you, Andy. Lutz, any differing thoughts there, or you're on the same page?
No, wholeheartedly agree with what Andy has said. I think we have no choice than to step up, and I do hope that we use this as an opportunity to really show what we are capable of, not just we as a pharmaceutical industry, but everyone who has responsibility, which ultimately includes the governments, includes the academics, includes many other institutions, and also that we do continue in this collaborative spirit that has made us very strong.
Absolutely, Andy and Lutz, it was an excellent panel. I thoroughly enjoyed moderating it, and it was especially enriching to get your comments and thoughts around what we have learned and what we can do more going forward, and how the pharmaceutical industry can remodel, reposition, reimagine itself in a post-COVID era where all are working together and for each other. Andy and Lutz, thank you so much for being here on this panel on BioAsia 2021, the virtual edition.
Pleasure indeed.
Thank you.